Posso saber o tema? Se der, que se dá errado,
muito bom dia. Good morning, welcome you. Uma alegria, uma honra. Queria agradecer a Irene Rizzini e a Monica Ruiz-Cassares por esse convite, por estar aqui nessa mesa Infâncias roubadas, as experiências de crianças e adolescentes fora do lugar. A mesa é composta pelas professoras Lorraine van Blerk, da Universidade de Dundee, na Escócia, Marit Ursin, do Norwegian Center for Child Research, na Noruega, Monica Ruiz-Cassares, da McGuill University, no Canadá, Vanessa Rojas, Young Lives, Peru, Irene Rizzini, daqui da PUC-Rio, eu, Sonia Kramer, do Departamento de Educação. Nós vamos começar de praxe de 15 a 20 minutos para cada apresentação e, em seguida, teremos um tempo para o debate. Gostaria de apresentar e convidar Lorraine van Blerk. Lorraine é professora de Geografia Humana e diretora associada de pesquisa na Escola de Ciências Sociais da Universidade de Dundee. Tem seu interesse de pesquisa, está baseada nos desafios e complexidades da pobreza, desigualdade social e justiça social, particularmente para pessoas jovens que crescem e se desenvolvem em circunstâncias difíceis, chamando atenção para as maneiras como essa experiência elas experimentam a marginalização e a discriminação. Ela escreveu, publicou mais de 80 trabalhos internacionais, é coautora dos livros da Routledge Books, os livros Children, Youth and the City e Doing Children's Geographies. Lorraine é também coeditora do jornal Children's Geographies. É uma alegria, um prazer, Lorraine.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Sonia for the introduction and for having me here to speak on this panel about young people out of place. What I'm going to talk about is work that I've been doing in Accra in Ghana, so a different context. And this research draws from a research project called Growing Up in the Streets, which has been working since 2012 across 3 African cities, Accra in Ghana, Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Harare in Zimbabwe. But I'm really just talking about young people's experiences and temporalities of growing up on the streets in Accra this morning. The paper that I'm giving talks about the dynamic ways in which young people in street situations experience their lives and create livelihoods tied into the urban fabric and social life of cities, despite experiencing exclusion, despite being considered out of place on the streets. The research itself undertook a participatory longitudinal approach, so in each city, 6 young street-connected young people undertook their own research with their own networks for a period of 3 years. So part of what this facilitates is an ability to look at how their lives change over time and how that impacts on their exclusion within cities, particularly as they try to carve out their own livelihoods. The research started in 2012, partly around the time when there was an international push to have a United Nations General Comment on street children, which Irene was involved in advocating for. And one of the key reasons for that push was for young people's right to be on the streets, and how young people were experiencing violence and forced removal. So it was across that backdrop that this research was exploring these issues. So, drawing on temporal, social and spatial dimensions of the street, I'm using a metaphor, undulations of urban life, to refer to these variations in young people's livelihood journeys, which are sometimes quite flat, where there are minor challenges and minor successes as young people explore different methods of livelihoods. But at other times their exclusion and out-of-placeness is much more apparent when they're experiencing large-scale problematic circumstances that take place. So one example, when I flew to Accra once actually, there was an article in the magazine on the airplane which highlighted the mayor of Accra having received an award for his environmental cleaning up of the city, which was juxtaposed by young people talking about how they had been forcibly removed, excluded, had their homes destroyed as part of this process of cleaning up the city. So this has major impacts which can be long-term. So despite being viewed as out of place, young people have very strong motivations to remain in cities. They're perceived as places where they can build adult lives that they value, that they want to have. However, they're highly visible, engaging in street vending, begging, undertaking all sorts of other types of labour, collecting recyclable materials, trading, etc. But due to the precarious position that they have, they're living on a very subsistence basis, unable to build material or financial assets to stabilise their position and escape any negative cycles of poverty that they're trapped within. Despite efforts to put young people through processes of vocational training that tends to come from governments or donor agencies funding NGOs, young people typically work without contract or employment protections and choose to work in the unregulated informal sector of the economy for various reasons. The operation of the informal economy is tied into the structures of power within cities, with some urban territories specifically marked out for vending, markets being controlled perhaps by political parties or criminal gangs, and so there's a speciality to the way in which you can engage in the informal economy, which is complex, highly competitive, and requires that individuals cultivate strong business skills and very detailed local knowledge of markets. So young people become experts in the operation of these informal economies and how to navigate those power relationships in particular territories and markets. They build livelihoods where opportunities exist and make their own judgments about the risks that they face engaging in particular activities. They're expert at negotiating contested spaces where adults protect access to economic opportunity or where governments exert control over the particular public spaces to protect interests of formal businesses. When additional pressure is applied by city authorities seeking to regulise informal economic activity, young people end up being forced to the more marginal spaces in the poorest parts of the city. This is a bit of a scary slide actually with the red, but the red highlights some quotations from our data, so just to point that out. A key livelihood strategy young people engage in is the trade of goods. They can be carried anywhere, taken to different places, many different materials are sold. But they have to build financial capital to buy goods and then work very hard to sell those goods to earn any kind of living. young people build up relationships with particular community members who may buy from them regularly. And this results in, if we think about these undulations, you know, climbing small hills, making successes in the pursuit of their earnings. And sometimes this can lead to greater successes. But it can be short-lived and truncated by more damaging experiences. So trading on the street where they come into conflict with city market authorities, for example, the officials they call abaye, which means they are coming, because they come and confiscate and destroy goods and damage livelihoods right at any moment in time. They even came this morning to destroy things. They came to sack everyone there. They said that they will not allow anyone to sell there. So within a moment, everything is gone. Positioning young people as outplaced due to their income-generating activities. Earning money is really important. If you don't have money, you can't access basic needs on the street. You need money to buy water to drink. You need money to go to the toilet. Everything has to be paid for in the city. So when you're excluded from working and earning a living, then you're excluded from basic needs in the city. In other instances, finding work can only ever be casual. Securing a job is difficult with a lack of ID and an inability to formalise working relationships. So where work is available, it's often risky and insecure. I offloaded the lorry, but the problem I have is I do not have an ID. I told the owner that I stayed on the street, and he told me that I have to get an ID to be able to work. Using the city as well can have other risks associated just by being in different spaces. Some risk that is associated with our work, like shoeshine work. You can walk to a place and there are bad people that know your business, and so they tell you to bring your money, and if you refuse, he will force you. So it is either the person will stab you with a knife or use a gun before he will get the money, so that makes our work very risky. So again, confined to particular places in the city due to the nature in which urban space is policed and controlled. So what I wanted to do is introduce two young people, just two, because I don't have a lot of time, and to look at their experiences of exclusion and resilience on the streets over time. So Josephine lives at railways in Accra, which means she lives along the railway platform. In 2012, when we started the research, she was about 19. She had 2 children, and she was looking to support them on her own. In the first 2 years of our research, Josephine experienced a number of these minor undulations. Her boyfriend left her, so she was on her own to care for the children. She engaged in hairdressing school to try and have some support to have her own business. But she failed to do this because she had nowhere to keep the tools and they kept getting stolen. So despite having training, it wasn't a successful livelihood option for her. She builds up business and has stock, but it's regularly stolen. And so at times her livelihood experiences are more successful than others. But she perseveres and through hard work has many minor achievements and many times in which she is more successful. Jonathan was also at railways on the railway platform. He was slightly younger, and he takes any job that's available, from offloading clothing bales, from trains, sorting them, helping people in the markets. Jonathan started in hourglass, or cleaning car windscreens, but diversified his livelihood strategies through longer-term relationships. He started building up regular relationships and offloading clothing bales. He even had a job as a signpost for a mobile phone company at one point. And so his experiences were generally, he would class as fairly successful in earning an income, although he did experience difficulties around being sick or being imprisoned, which causes quite a lot of difficulties in terms of being able to pay for bail or any of that. He managed to set up a game centre, which I'll come on to, but again, it wasn't an easy process and found that things were taken away or stolen from him. So we have these small successes that young people achieve on a daily basis, but what is often missing is how young people's lives are shaped by significant events that permeate informal areas of the city on what may seem to be a more regular basis. The impacts of these events go unnoticed in short-term research. They are snapshots in time that don't explore how, over time, these kind of particular incidents can impact on young people's outplaceness in the city. And so a longitudinal lens was important for this. It highlights the precariousness of informal areas for young people and highlights an underlying tension around risk and the permanence of place. The Accra Metropolitan Authority regularly mark buildings or kiosks, wooden shacks, with dates for removal. And those signs can stay there for months and years, but at any moment they come along and destroy and knock down and tear away young people's livelihoods. And they're very starkly positioned as being out of place. So, I don't know if you can see on this slide, the bottom picture is actually a barber shop in Art Center, which is the top picture. And it's really a rubbish area behind a nice craft market. And it's a very large informal settlement. But the rubbish area here, where the boys built their barber shop, they had trained, they set up the shop, they were doing really well, they had a really good clientele, and then after many years of this area, large area of informal settlement, the AMA came along and destroyed it. Everything was demolished. Within an instant, these young people had lost their livelihood that they built up. They were positioned as completely in the wrong place. They lost their business, they lost their house, and they lost their clientele. People were dispersed. And so, by looking at these events in a longer term process, we can start to see how young people develop resilience in the streets and how they respond to events like this rather than just seeing the event as a major problem, which it is, but they do develop resilience to this and how this happens time and time again. So, returning to Jonathan and Josephine, an event that particularly shaped their lives was a fire in the market next to railways. The fire destroyed the entire market, and the reason for this is because there were so many people in the market illegally. There wasn't just the regular market stalls, there were so many more market stalls and people were living there and sleeping there. And so this fire occurred, destroying the entire market on Sunday, the 5th of May, 2013. Young people who lived there lost all their possessions. They'd lost their source of livelihood. Most of them do trading, running errands, helping in the market. Jonathan talks about his involvement in the fire. He lost everything, but what he talks about is how he was helping the market traders to save things from the fire. He says, we helped a lot. When the fire was blazing, even guys that I thought were stubborn were crying for market women. I was surprised. We were not crying for ourselves. I left my clothes and other things to burn while I helped others because I know how much a bale of clothes costs. We moved to where the fire was and helped people bring lots of good outside. And I know some of the women, they are kind to us, they give us stuff. You can hear the sirens now. So he talks about leaving his possessions behind to help market traders, partly because this was his livelihood and this was his way of dealing with the fire, was to help and help his fellow market traders in order that he would still have a livelihood option post the fire. A day or two after the fire, the city authorities moved in to clear the debris. And this resulted in a standoff between the authorities and the traders, who accused the authorities of deliberately setting fire to the market. The police were called in to control irate traders, and this resulted in firing of warning shots and tear gas. And Jonathan also talks about how it affected his child. the tear gas and how they had to leave the market area. Josephine was also affected by the fire. Her sleeping place next to the market and belongings were burnt. This was especially problematic as it affected her livelihood strategies, as the goods that she sells were destroyed. She says, I'm going to buy Brazil chains, the copper chains that are now in vogue. It was my belongings that got burned, so she had to use any resources that she had to try and start her business again. She also had to move, and for her that was difficult because her son was then going to have to go to school in a new area, and she felt the area was very unsafe for him, and it was a big worry for her. So although we see the disruption and the difficulties that young people are facing in this situation, they are incredibly resilient in terms of moving forward and building livelihood strategies despite their exclusion and positioning within the city as out of place. And in the rebuilding of the market, Jonathan was able to seize an opportunity to find a space in the market's centre and build his own game centre and start his own business. He used the opportunity of disruption and the positive relationships that he had with stallholders to find a suitable place to construct a new centre. He knew someone who could tap into the electricity supply, so he was able to access power. And he also offered a safe space for others to keep their belongings or for young children to sleep. And so, in many ways, the fire gave him an opportunity that he was able to take on board because of the relationships he had with people there. And I think by looking longitudinally, we see that young people do experience significant isolation in the city and exclusion in terms of building their livelihoods, but they're also incredibly resilient in using those spaces, and just the multiple times, if you look at this over longer periods of time, the multiple realities that they face with both these major experiences and minor experiences and how they continue to progress and build adult lives of value is incredibly useful in terms of thinking about policy and how young people are living in urban space. It's not a time-bounded event. They're not just there when they're children. They're growing up, they're trying to make their own way, they're trying to provide livelihoods for their families as they have children. And so these undulations of urban life on the streets creates challenges for young people to build and maintain adult lives of value that need to be supported within government policies when we're exploring the way in which cities are managed and created. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Muitas questões, que eu diria, como manter-se humano numa situação tão desumana, e eu tenho certeza que há muitas questões para que a gente possa refletir em seguida. E minha alegria de apresentar Marit Ursin, que fala em seguida. Marit é professora associada em infância interdisciplinar e estudos de juventude na Norwegian Center for Child Research, no Departamento de Educação and Lifelong Learning, da Universidade Norwegian of Science and Technology. Marit Ursin faz pesquisa qualitativa com crianças, adolescentes e famílias na Noruega e na América Latina. Seus interesses acadêmicos estão ligados a direitos da infância e cidadania dos jovens, diversas formas de migração de jovens e crianças, bem como o sentido de pertencimento de crianças e jovens. Ela dá aulas de métodos qualitativos em estudos da infância, assim como direitos da infância, tanto no bacharelado como nível de PhD, e é editora do jornal acadêmico Barn.
Ok, but one of the common issues is actually the way young people is transitioning into adulthood, I think. So, I don't know how many are very familiar with the Norwegian context, but very often we're perceived as being a pioneer within children's rights. We were the first country in the world to have children's ombudsman, and we also had a law already in 1981 deciding that children should have the right to co-determination. So many have been surprised when Norway has been massively criticized in both the public but also by the UN Committee for Children's Rights in recent years on how our child welfare system has encountered ethnic minority families. So today I'm going to focus on this issue. So growing up in Norway, just to give you some brief background, all children aligned with the UNCRC are entitled and obliged to attend primary and lower secondary school. Any work that interferes with the child's formal education is forbidden, which is also aligned with the UNCRC. Children in Norway today very often have a minimal contribution in household chores. So parents and even the state regard schooling as children's prime focus and responsibilization. But also their engagement in organized activities, cultural sport activities is prioritized. And we can say that their childhood is supported by one-way caring obligations. So I want to dwell on one case where we interviewed many young people in Norway. So this girl, Amara, was one of many. I'm going to use it because of a short period of time to show an example on some of the tensions between social workers and actually teachers, kind of worldview on what childhood should be, and some of these ethnic minority families. So when we met Amara, she was 16 years old. She was born in a West African country. She had family in Norway, father, stepmother, and a younger sister. Both her father and stepmother worked a lot, and her stepmother also traveled for long periods of time. So the Child Welfare Services was involved in her life from she was approximately 12 years old. She explains to us, I became kind of a mini-mom, and when there was a lot of responsibility for me, there were periods at school where I was less focused and so because I had so much to do at home. And then she elaborates that she very often did the household activities, cleaning, cooking, and she also sometimes picked up her kid sister in kindergarten. And I want to go on this and kind of, even though she's living in Norway, think about her cultural background and what we often call cultures of relatedness. So in other cultures, children are raised to remain more loyal and connected to the family over lifetime. And family life is marked by generational interdependence. Children have rights and responsibilities. This is very much aligned with what Joe Boyden was talking about yesterday, but I also bear in mind the comments of Jamie Wilson about how it might not be a good thing to also state that they have responsibilities. And of course, we do know the African Charter, and that is actually explicitly stated that they have rights and responsibilities. So I think it's important to remember her cultural background in order to understand where she's coming from. So let's return to Amara. She continued saying, I spoke with my teacher. I told her the truth because the teacher eventually kind of starts realizing that she's less focused and sometimes she's not doing her homework. That there's a lot of things going on, picking up my sister, arriving late because of the bus, like that. And then she said, no, this is way too much responsibility, and continued. you should not do this much, you should be a child. So obviously, the way she's being raised in her family really contradicts the expectations of the teacher and also the educational system in Norway, where the focus should be on playing, having fun, but also focusing on schools. So her teacher eventually takes contact with the child welfare system, and she's being removed to a foster family. And the reason is that it's a temporary solution, and she is supposed to just relax and know how it is to be a kid, basically. So the school teacher and the child welfare caseworker's view on what Amara should and should not do is rooted in a more individualistic way of thinking about childhood. Where the parents in the Nordic countries very often raise their children with a sense of themselves, their own values, beliefs, and interests. And of course, this way of raising children is enabled with a strong welfare state, where a lot of the caregiving tasks are actually ensured by the state rather than relatives. So, looking at ethnic minority childhood in a majority perspective in Norway, what is perceived as normal in Amara's cultural background is interpreted as both deviant and problematic by the Norwegian education and child welfare systems. What is said is that she's being parentified. I'm not sure if this is a concept familiar to all of you, but basically they're saying that she's doing adult tasks. So what is reckoned in Norway as tasks considered for adults. Of course, this is a cultural relative concept. So the problem is that she's caught in between two cultures. School and homework is not perceived as work, but as correct, suitable activities, whilst household tasks are seen as deteriorating her school achievements. So this is like the overall understanding of what's going on from their perspective. So when she looks back at her period with the foster family, she says, "When I lived there, I had to relax and be with the youth, right? I realized it was nice, it was somehow good. But at the same time, I also realized that it wasn't for me, quite frankly, because I wanted to be active and also cook and make and clean and for I realized that I became useful. I became useful in the family. And Dad couldn't do it without me anyway. It was a very nice feeling." So she actually wants to go back to her dad. So eventually she does return to her dad, and she lives with him for 2 years, and things go great. But after some while, her dad leaves both Amara and the kid's sister with a so-called auntie, a woman from the same village in his country of origin, and he travels abroad and stays for quite a long period. And then this auntie, she contacts the child welfare system again, so she's once again being part of the system. In the meantime, she's now 15. She has a new boyfriend, and she's applied for this school, which has specialization in dance, and she really is eager to come in and start this at this high school. What she doesn't know is that the child welfare system is working on her case, and they decide that she has to return to the foster family. And she explains, "It all happened behind my back, so they had meetings, they talked with each other and all that. And then they said, 'Do you know what? We think that your parents haven't given you proper care, so we think you should move back to your foster family, and you should live there until you're 18. And she says afterwards, "I really wanted to move away from my mom, from my dad, from the child welfare system. I wanted to be on my own." And she explains that she has been a so-called mini-mom for many years, and she was as ready as ever to actually live by herself. And in Norway, this is not actually something very strange, because a lot of the rural teenager actually move away from their parents to go to particular high schools. So it isn't like really unheard of, but anyways, she's not allowed to do that. So the 3 points I want to make in relation to this decision of the child welfare system and children's rights. First of all, obviously the overall guiding principle, the best interest of the child. There's this tension between what the child welfare workers feel and what the MARA actually thinks. And that brings me to the second, of course, that they're supposed to be heard in all cases that affect them, and even more so when she's 15. So above the age of 12, it also should have a considerable impact on the decision. And this is obviously not what she felt was going on, or how she recalls this in the interview. And this also brings me to the last point, that in Norway, when you're 15, you actually have the right to decide your education. And because she was being moved back to the foster family in the rural areas, there were no specialization in that, so she had to give up on that. So she also lost that right. So lastly, some quotes from Amara in the end was, "I'll soon turn 17, she laughs. So it would be nice to be listened to, because I'm not. I'm not listened to when I live in a foster home. I'm not their biological child, but I'm not adopted either. I don't belong to a parent, right? It's like I'm being thrown back and forth. The state, I belong to the state, and it's terrible when you're a youth at my age." And she actually gives examples of when she wants to visit her boyfriend, the foster parents are not allowed to let her go. So it's this huge process of bureaucracy for just to visit her boyfriend for a couple of days. And also she wants to visit friends elsewhere. So she really has much less space to maneuver than all her peers in the same school, because some of them were actually living with the boyfriends. Some of them lived in studio apartments to be able to study what they wanted. So it was kind of a stark contrast. So before I end, I just want to have some overall concluding comments. First, I want to focus on the politicization of the child welfare service in Norway today. Obviously, it's the child welfare service that is given the legitimacy to articulate children's best interests. So we're not taking into account, even though we do continuously emphasize children's rights to participation, this is not happening very often in practice, especially when they do not agree with the adults. Child welfare service has become a battlefield of diverging views, what is perceived as the proper childhood, proper upbringing, and also proper development in terms of what skills you should learn and not. And childcare institutions represent state engagement and regulation, and play a vital role in defining and controlling normality, and also what's considered deviant. I also want to put this in a larger perspective. Having background doing studies in Latin America and within childhood studies, it always strikes my mind that this kind of childhood is actually very, very common, even though it might not be seen as such within the child welfare system. So, as Punch argues, the most common time of childhood in the world is that of children in the global south, many of whom work. So this is actually not irregularity. More so, these childhoods are considered as deviant when examined with the globalized model of childhood. So that's when they become problematic, is when they are starting to be compared with this ideal notion of childhood. But I also am against this division of childhood as of the North and the South. And I really want to emphasize that in Norway, we have many different groups of children who actually do engage in different kinds of work. As this is an example of immigrant children, but we also have a lot of the rural children and young people engaging in farm works, and we have Sami children, our indigenous populations, where children contribute in reindeer herding, for instance, and we also have children with parents with some kind of illness or disabilities. So it's not something that only exists in the global south, and I think we need to be aware of that. So having a more critical perspective on the UNCRC, as we do know, is based on this Western notion drawing from Enlightenment thinking, and the idea of the rational, autonomous human, or that is the man. And I think, as Aiken has recently argued, that contemporary similar forms of universal rights do not serve young people but ignore dimensions such as class, gender, and ethnicity. So it's based on this idea of our individuals being the sole pinnacle of society and ignoring kind of these more networks that they're embedded in. It's also, I think it's important to be a bit critical, even in Norway, how children are being obliged to attend formal schooling was achieving learning through labor. So opening up how we perceive education rather than only literacy, maths, like this very narrowly defined way of perceiving education, which is really something we need to criticize in Norway because of this test regime and the PISA tests and everything. It has just become worse, in my opinion. But it also promotes an understanding of participation as the individual's ability to widen its room for maneuver. So it has become something individualistic rather than something often related to talking, as Liebel and Sadie have argued, rather than perceiving participation as doing, as being involved in a wider community. And I also do think that this is very often connected to this traditional Western way of thinking about it. My last point is that I think very often I do acknowledge that we have to put an age limit, but still, when we grow it at 18, as we see here, it's quite arbitrary as well, because some children are allowed to do more than others also at the same age, in 15, 16. But of course, we also have to be aware that this ignores the conceptions of childhood and youth and the perceptions of socially appropriate roles for children and youth, and how it varies across time and place and culture. So I think in some instances what we see is that it might infantilize children. Thank you.
Thank you, Marit. O rosto de Jonathan e Josefine, da fala da Lorraine, acho que agora tomam o rosto de Amara e as contradições entre o pertencimento, a responsabilidade e os direitos da infância. E chamo agora e convido, nós vamos ouvir Monica Ruiz-Cassares, gostaria de apresentar. Mônica é professora associada, PhD, da divisão de Psiquiatria Social e Transcultural da McGuill University, investigadora da Sherpa, Instituto Universitário, que tem como sua responsabilidade comunidades culturais em Montreal, no Canadá. Ela é membro da Committee Standing da International Society for Child Indicators e trabalhou com políticas e programas de avaliação de serviços humanos internacionais por mais de 20 anos. Ela lidera métodos mistos, estudos e pesquisas em métodos mistos sobre proteção à infância e bem-estar em estudos cross-culturais, especialmente com países de baixo ou médio desenvolvimento em contextos de separação de crianças e pais. Ela está particularmente interessada em temas relacionados a questões éticas e metodológicas envolvendo a saúde global e a proteção em termos de pesquisa com e por crianças.
Bom dia. It's going to go in English, but at least start with that. Good wish. Okay. So, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm going to be summarizing some as the result of a literature review we've done, but also it's 18 years of working with targeted households, mostly in Namibia. So you will see the quotes come from studies that I have conducted, and the rest comes from the wealth of research that has been conducted with these populations across the world, but mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa, trying to look at why targeted households are marginalized in this particular context, largely because of poverty, orphanhoods, and AIDS, and how they're considered a social problem because they take on tax and role, and then it really follows previous presentations as breadwinners, as caregivers that are considered out of place and a threat to the social and moral order in their communities. So very briefly, most children live with their parents or with other adults. They might not even be related. Even in the case of children in the streets, sometimes they will have adults that they might even go back to in the evening, so that's the dotted lines. But I'm going to be focusing specifically on targeted households. There's not a one definition, there's a range. But in most cases, this is a group of young people who cook and eat together. The head of the household is considered a child, and there it varies. Some offers will stop at 18, following the convention. In many cases, because this needs to be defined contextually, they might be older, but maybe they're still in school or they're not employed, they're still living in the house, and the relationship of the other children to the head of the household is not that of parenthood. Now, estimating how many are there is not easy, partly because there's not one definition, and partly because this is a very fluid living arrangement where some young people might live on their own, then they go and live with an auntie or an uncle, then they go and live alone. So it's very difficult to look at those trends. And they don't only emerge as a result of HIV/AIDS. In fact, if we even think of the case of South Africa, where the apartheid migrant labor policies led many adults to have to go away for employment. It still happens in other countries. There's 60 million children in China who are left behind by their migrant parents looking for employment. So there are different reasons why the households might emerge, but I want to focus particularly on the case of HIV/AIDS because it affects largely this population in Sub-Saharan Africa. You see that. Of the 37 million people who are right now living with HIV/AIDS, about 1.8 in the last estimate are children. There's been great progress with the use of antiretrovirals in reducing orphanhood. The adults are living longer with the uptake of the mother-to-child transmission, preventing that through IRBs. Then fewer children are being born that are HIV positive. So in a way, there's been some positive move in reducing orphanhood. However, targeted households still exist. And I'll just read one quote from one of my studies. After the funeral, people started to ignore us. My mother's relatives chased us away. Then we stayed with a friend's mother for a month, but she started to isolate us. She gave more food to her own children. We only got porridge. We don't have another place to go. So I wanted to show in the children's words the change in nature of this living arrangement and the complexity of reasons that might lead to the creation of child-headed households, the fluidity of this phenomenon. Different studies have found different things. I'll pick one of my studies, but there is real resonance with other researchers. So what I found, for instance, working in the border with Angola, was that many children actually presented this as their own decision. I don't want to use the word choice, because choice is a tricky word, isn't it? When we work under structural constraints. But their own decision. And sometimes this was a result of abuse from relatives. So if the other alternative is to move on with relatives who might not treat you properly, treat you different than they treat their own children, or maybe even separate you from your siblings, and that you want to keep close to your brothers and sisters, then they might decide that they want to stay on their own. There are other studies that have also found, as I did, cases of property grabbing and abuse from relatives. Now, this is not always the case, but I wanted to start by at least setting the background of vulnerability, not that I like the term, but just for us to know what are some of the unmet needs and challenges that young people in child-headed households face. Poverty, malnutrition has been well documented, severe social ties, compounded often, as I said, by tensions with family over inheritance and also decline in school attendance. Again, a number of studies that show that orphans are not more likely to drop out of school than other studies if you control for other variables. So it depends how we look at it. But certainly, child-headed households often, because particularly the elder children in the household, because of the responsibilities to take care of their brothers and sisters, they might arrive late to school, their attendance might suffer, and certainly their productivity or their educational results are affected. They do have supportive relations, and I'll come back to that later, and that was part of what I focused on in my work. But there are strained relations with neighbors as well as with family, and they're very rarely treated as equals to adults in the community. This leads to social isolation, vulnerability to HIV infection as they need to earn a living. Sometimes they will engage in transactional sex to be able to bring in food to the house. And ultimately, as they drop out of the school and their skills are jeopardized, then finding proper employment becomes more difficult. So how do child-headed households challenge common understandings of childhood? And I picked only some of those. Seeing children or childhood as a period of innocent time for play and education, which is probably more common in the global north, or seeing them as subject to adults' decisions, or for child-headed households, the idea that they are completely alone and they're only recipients of care. So let's look at the first one, conceptions of childhood and family structure. In Western society, there's this tendency to separate the world of adults from the world of children and to see childhood as a period of dependency and in a way, incompetence, immaturity. But work, as we heard in the two previous presentations, both Marit and Lorraine talked about how work is actually part of childhood in most of the world. Even if in many cases, and the children who are living with their parents, this could be like a secondary role, the role of after play or education. And also, even if they're engaged in other activities, they, as I said, they would be secondary. So the tasks that the heads of the household take on are often seen as unchildlike. This, however, contrasts also with the most common vision of the African family that would be multi-generational and would be extended. And so in that way as well, child-headed households challenge those perceptions. And Marit also mentioned this idea of infantilization. So they're kind of between two worlds. On the one hand, they might be considered taking on knowledge and roles that are appropriate for adults in that particular context. And from another view, they might be seen as needing overprotection and in a way infantilized from the tasks they take on. So here we go with another quote. After the death of my mother, I wanted to call suicide, but I got advice from my friend. She told me, if you want to call suicide, look, you're having your young sister. Who's going to take care of your young sister? It would be better if some of those relatives of yours liked you, but they hate you. If you're going to call suicide, there is no one who's going to take care of your sister. Which is a good segue for the second challenge, which is the challenge of adult decision making. Now, families, and I would say some of these decisions that I'm illustrating through the quotes seem like tough decisions for you to make. So the fact that there's this vision that adults are always making decisions for young people, we see that definitely these heads of household are making tough ones. Families are the primary space for socializing children, but in the case of child-headed households, there's generally there's not an adult that is permanently present in the household. And so children sometimes are perceived as a threat, maybe because adults are not there to pass on and enforce the respect for the social norms through supervision and discipline, sometimes even punishment and control. I'd say even that adults in doing so somehow serve as for someone coming from the health field, maybe like first-line prevention by protecting children from the potential consequences of non-compliance with social norms. We also have on the other side what Brooke calls everyday agency. This is an expression that comes actually from her interviews with young people in Zambia in heads of household, who would not refer to their daily tasks and responsibilities, and the decisions they make are something that was extraordinary or unusual, but rather as expressions of agency in their daily life. This is just what you do. This is your day-to-day. So here goes in children's words again. What makes me upset is to play the role of a mother, looking after children. At the beginning, I did not accept it. People wanted to bury the youngest brother with my mother, but I decided to keep the baby. I struggled to raise him and wondered if I would know how to do it right. Again, because another tough decision. That's it. Okay. Third challenge, the challenge of seeing children as completely alone or recipients, exclusively recipients of care. Now here I'm using, I've used social network analysis to map the networks of children in heads of household in one of my studies. And in this study, we found that all children actually had someone to turn up to for help, and half of those people were actually other children, providing all types of support: recreation, companionship, information, emotional support. The only type of support that they would in turn to other children for would be material aid, and that was provided always by adults. And I raised a number of issues about the risk of dependence and abuse from this asymmetrical material aid that they would receive from individual adults or from aid agencies. Anyhow, I'll come back to the idea of mutuality later. What I wanted to show is, the study looked at network size, network density, and if anybody's interested, I'll be happy to share the publication, but I just wanted to show in a visual way how there were about almost 60% of the children over 0.5. And we know that when personal networks are dense, they're generally better at providing care in times of crisis. So actually the children were not as disconnected as we would have imagined by thinking they're heads of household, they're on their own. They're actually, not all of them, you can see that we had 12% that were quite low. But many of them have pretty dense networks they could turn up to. Now, child-headed households are sometimes talked in the literature as a risk to themselves and to the wider society, considered to be deviant households whose members are more prone to petty crime, to be part of gangs, or to have early sexual experiences. Even when young people drop out of school because they have to care for their siblings, they will be conceptualized as delinquent dropout behavior, as Harriet Bradbury put it. In some study, and that particular study that Jim Haley and Jill Bradbury did in KwaZulu-Natal, they documented young people reporting a lot of close surveillance and censorship from adults in the community, which is very interesting how they were treated with suspicion. In fact, it was very, very gendered. So the boys were considered sluts and the girls were considered whores by the community, the way they perceived that. It was even internalized sometimes to the point that the elder child is going to control the girls in the family and control the movement and the sexuality of girls, mirroring adult surveillance. That's what other studies have found. So, let me see if I can manage to get this going. Okay. So researchers have found that basically child-headed households end up adopting a lot of responsibility without authority. They're caught between two types of relationships: the protective and the caring relationship, the support they get from their own group, the children in the household, other children, as well as adults in the community. And also the moral judgment of children's behavior, the gossiping that happens, them being considered dangerous and wild, in a way morally inferior to adults, and certainly in need of discipline. So here is where we just published last year with a couple of my students. We're putting forth a call for more reciprocity, and it resonates with what Joe said yesterday at some point. So we saw how children are portrayed as care recipients, but around the world we see that care reception is often accompanied by the provision of assistance in different forms, and the issue of reciprocity in children being perceived as unable to give back to society as adults do is something that kept us thinking. And so in this recent study, we proposed using the degree of reciprocity of exchange, or mutuality of exchange, we call it sometimes, as an indicator of balance in power relations and in the stability of child's position in the social network. So advocating for children in child-headed households, all children, but this is particularly child-headed households, not only as receivers or targets of support, but also as active agents in their own lives and potential supporters of other people. Now, of course, this is a big disclaimer. This must be done in a way that is developmentally appropriate, culturally sensitive, and that gives priority to the best interest of the child. So for those of you who are maybe familiar with the kind of social network literature, Barry Wellman, etc., reciprocity can be deferred. It means it doesn't have to be immediate. It can be direct or it can be indirect. So sometimes I give back. If Lorraine helps me, I give her back. Sometimes she helps me and I will help Irene. And I might help Irene later on. So it's part of being part of a web of exchange. It can be in kind, in same kind of different kinds. So we might choose exactly the same thing, or it might be another type of service. So I'll end, because this might be the very beginning. The very beginning is asking, right? So I'll end with a quote from one of the children in one of my studies. I learned something important today to ask, because you asked me how we're living. This helps me, because since my mother passed away, nobody has asked me this question. Thank you. That's it.
A primeira fala, thank you, Mônica, dessas apresentações tocantes. A Mônica traz essa pergunta, né, que se entrelaça com outras questões que vinham sendo trazidas: escolha ou decisão, responsabilidade e ausência, infantilização e adultização, responsabilidade sem autoridade, risco para si, risco para a sociedade, e essa pergunta, né, que nunca tinha sido feita, né, e essa pergunta que mobiliza porque nunca tinha sido feita. Muito obrigada. Mônica, queria então convidar a Vanessa Rojas. Vanessa é graduada em antropologia e tem mestrado em ciências políticas da PUC do Peru. É professora e pesquisadora adjunta na RAID Group for the Analysis of Development. O seu trabalho focaliza em antropologia da educação, infância e adolescência, tendo como foco temas ligados a transições educacionais, bem-estar da criança, qualidade educacional e relações de poder. Vanessa trabalhou no Qualitative Component of Young Lives entre 2007 e 2011, e em 2012 trabalhou no Early Education Department do Ministry of Education do Peru, como coordenadora de alternativas de educação e educação infantil. Atualmente, ela é coordenadora de pesquisa qualitativa com jovens, vidas jovens no Peru.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me today, and this is an amazing table. So what I'm going to speak to talk today is about a study we did last year in Peru, which is framed in early cohabitation on early marriage. But I have to say first that in Peru, marriage is not as common, early marriage is not as common as cohabitation. That doesn't mean that it is very different in practice. Actually, when you want to start cohabitation, or when these young people want to start cohabitation, they families did some arrangement in order to decide where they are going to live, and they even start cohabitation under the promises of future marriage. But it is very common that it never happens due to the cost of that, or because it is a custom. The parents of these young people in Peru, they never got married. Cohabitation is very common. So this is a thing not only in Peru, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean. According to the United Nations, 23% of the women between 20 and 24 years old got married or started cohabitation before turning 18 years old. In Young Lives, the study which I am working right now, we have also some evidence related to it. When we did the survey, when older cohort was around 19 years old, we found that 25% of women in the sample were mothers, and of them, 80% were cohabitating or married. So what the study, the researchers found, it was a close relation between early pregnancy and the beginning of cohabitation, and it is not a cause, it is not a consequence. They just mentioned that they are very related, because as I'm going to show you later, some young women leave school first and then start cohabitation. So as this was the context, in Young Lives we have this concern on how these young people was doing their transitions to motherhood, to fatherhood, or cohabitation. No? So we wanted to know what they perceive about what happened when they were very young, how it was to be a mother at a very young age, or what happened to be to live with a partner as a very young women or men. And we really tried to get to look for men in the sample, because we wanted to explore also about masculinities, but it was very difficult to first to find them, and second to convince them to be part of the study, because they were very busy because of their responsibilities out of the house, but also they were very clear on saying that these topics, parenthood and marriage, and probably how this starts, is a very women thing. They don't believe that they have a voice on that. So we finally get information from 3 sides, because we wanted to have different experiences of being in cohabitation or being a mother or father. So we went to a rural site in the Amazon of Peru, a peri-urban site in the north of Peru, and an urban site in the capital city. And we interviewed 34 case studies, 28 were women and only 6 were men. Out of the 28, 17 women of the sample start cohabitation before 18 years old, and the other ones did it between 19 and 21. And all of them said that when they started cohabitation, wasn't that like they will expect to start cohabitation later on their own lives, no? Maybe when they were 25, 26. And all the men who started cohabitation did it after they were 18 years old. So why start cohabitation before 18 first in Peru? So I want to share this story of Yolanda because it kind of summarizes what we find in the case studies. So Yolanda started cohabitation with her partner, at 16. She remembers that her father said that the studying is not worthy. He said that I will not finish my studies because I will end up with a husband first. The father also beats her. He always told me that, so I quitted my studies. I met him and we joined. I was excited about it. I thought I will finally could make my own life. But he is a bit jealous. Sometimes when I say I want to go around, no, he said, he does not let me go by myself. And I say nothing. I want to have my studies done, but it would not happen. I would have to break up with him. He wouldn't let me study. So what Yolanda's story is telling us is that at the very beginning of the cohabitation, there is a search of freedom, but what ended up is that they are finally in oppressive relation with their partners. So what we have is a kind of circle. At the very beginning, they want to escape from experiences of violence they are having in their own household. They are victims of violence by their parents, mostly the father, and they felt that they are under oppressive relationships. They don't have decision making, for example, if they want to have a boyfriend or if they want to go around. So they felt they want to break that oppression and they want to be free. So they leave home, and as soon as they leave home, they start or they begin with their sex life with a little knowledge of SRH. So pregnancy is just very close for that moment, and marriage and cohabitation starts. And when it starts, traditional gender roles reproduce at home. So they stay at their houses, their husbands or their partners go away to work, and what happens normally is that women go to their partners' lands or their partners' houses to stay, so they felt a kind of isolated of their own network because they are in a new place, not near from their family, with only the family of her partner, and they feel alone most of the time inside the house because they are not allowed to go away because they have very jealous partners. So what it ended up is like they are in oppressive relations again, and in sometimes they are experiences, they have experience of violence, domestic violence inside their own house, no? So what it was very common to, in all the interviews we made, it was this idea, no? It was not as I expected that it was going to be. So cohabitation keeps them away from educational opportunities, not only because some of them drop education to start cohabitation. Some of them did it before, as I already said. So they wanted to finish their basic education, but they are not allowed because they are under these unbalanced power relations. So it is very difficult for them. So that marriage or cohabitation affect all the same. Well, what we found is like the youngest girls are the ones who are in a more vulnerable situation. And the youngest girls are rural girls who are living in the rural side, in the Amazon, and also are the poorest ones. So we have some girls who start cohabitation around 14 years old with their parents' consent, and at the very beginning they say also with their own consent. They wanted to do it. But when we start these several interviews with them, what we find in those stories is that they were very vulnerable because they were living in poverty, extreme poverty, and the girls who dropped education, they were girls who already dropped education, they were in their house, and as soon as they drop education, they start cohabitation very, very soon. And they were facing violence, no? So they are girls that they are searching for protection, but not only protection of care. We have some testimonies, interviews that says that girls were looking also for economic protection. For example, there was a girl who told us, he offered me to buy me clothes, he offered me food, and I doesn't have those conditions, so I decided that I wanted to improve my life. So for example, Leonor says here, my grandparents, she lives only with her grandparents, always went to work to the field, and I stay at home. I was alone, cooking, cleaning. I was left alone. I don't want to not stay alone, so I thought I'd better go with him. She left secondary education before cohabitation because their grandparents couldn't pay for their transportation to secondary education, who was in the closest city, so they can afford the transportation for her, so she decided to stay at home. And Leonora started cohabitation between 13 and 14 years old, no? So what this is very, what we did was also to look at the stories of these girls, because as we are part of the longitudinal study, we have information of those girls since they were 8 years old. We interviewed them when they were 24, and we were talking about their past, their experiences, how they experienced that. So when we look at their service, and they have a self-administrated service that gather information about risk, behaviors, violence too. And what we found is that girls who started cohabitation around 14 reported that they feel that they've been forced to have sex at least one time in their lives. So, and they didn't speak that out loud with us, but what they say is that they reported being beaten by their partners at least one time. And their partners are very much older than them. They are like 10 years more older than them. So that group, the rural girls, the youngest rural girls, are like the most vulnerable of this study. But starting cohabitation or parenthood after ending school makes a difference for young women, was another question that we have. And I think that it is a yes and a no, because some of them, the ones who finish school, have the possibility to access a job, a formal job, with the minimum of the salary, but they have this possibility. They also have the possibility to go for further education, but since they are under unequal relations, it is very difficult for them to go to search for more education. So unequal gender relations is the big thing here. But under this sample, we also have some women who get finally access higher education institutes in Peru, but family played a very important role in that. So if they have a very protective family, they could go to, they could access further education. If her family wasn't present, it would be very difficult for her. There are no daycare services. So, social and gender norms pull young women under unequal relations and violence. We gather also information from elder women in the community and authorities, and this was very common. It is not good to be lazy. If you have a husband, you have to serve him. Or another quote is, because it is your husband, you have to deal with violence. That's the way it is. So understanding this early marriage or advocating in order to end cohabitation or to reduce these numbers, we need to understand first that there is a problem about violence. In 2016 in Peru, thousands of men and women protest against violence toward women because of this movement, Ni Una Menos, No One Less. And in social media, thousands of women share their own violence stories, and in some cases, some testimonials told an awful experience of physical and sexual violence since childhood. Latest figure in 2017 showed that violence towards children in Peru, and that girls are the ones who face a life trajectory marked by violence in different types, physical, sexual, and psychological. To sum up, experiences of young people in cohabitation point out that violence and equal gender relations are at the beginning and at the end to the chain. So we need to understand first those topics in order to advocate for the reduction of cohabitation, early cohabitation, and also early pregnancy. We need to discuss the role of education in our country. It's not easy as it is happening here. Girls are finishing basic education. We don't have a lot big rates on dropout in Peru, but are they receiving what they need to imagine a different life in the school? What is the education given to them? And also Joe was saying that yesterday, no? Are they receiving information in the school about SRH? No. Gender and roles inequality, are they questioning? No. So the question of gender roles and stereotypes and SRH information within the framework of right-based approach is needed since the beginning of the schooling. Children and adolescents require to be empowered to understand gender inequalities to fight for their rights. But as I said before, we are in a very complex context. In Peru, we have ministries of education who have been questioned by fostering gender equality policies, and 2 of them already resigned. So it's not easy, but we need to work on it. So thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Obrigada, Vanessa. Vanessa traz para a mesa os temas do deixar a casa e a situação de coabitação, a pergunta como escapar da violência num contexto que é produtor de violência, de escolaridade interrompida, e conclui com essa urgência de se discutir o papel da educação e uma abordagem de gênero em educação. Gostaria então de convidar a professora Irene Rizzini. Irene é socióloga, doutora pelo Instituto Universitário de Pesquisa do Rio de Janeiro e do PERJ, tem formação em psicologia pela Universidade de Santa Úrsula, mestrado em serviço social na Universidade de Chicago, é professora atualmente do Departamento de Serviço Social da PUC do Rio, diretora do Centro Internacional de Estudos e Pesquisas sobre a Infância, o CIESPI, em convênio com a PUC. Foi presidente da Rede Internacional de Intercâmbio de Pesquisa na área de infância, Child Watch International Research Network, de 2002 a 2009, e foi professora visitante da Universidade de Notre Dame em Ciências Sociais, com foco em estudos latino-americanos em 2016, tendo realizado seu pós-doutorado no International Studies. Ela recebeu o prêmio Guggenheim de 2008 e 2009. Foi professora visitante na Universidade de Edimburgo, na Escócia, de agosto a novembro de 2017. Coisa longa. Nossa, é de casa aqui. Bom dia. Bom dia. Português agora. But amazing studies, wonderful presentations. Vou fazer meu melhor agora, né? Então, eu vou basear essa breve reflexão em vários estudos desenvolvidos ao longo dos últimos anos na PUC e no Centro Internacional de Estudos e Pesquisas sobre a Infância, o CIESPI. Em particular, eu resolvi focar um tema mais ligado à minha atual bolsa como cientista do nosso estado, da FAPERJ, que vem olhando para as trajetórias de crianças e adolescentes em situação de rua, mas que estão hoje em acolhimento institucional, que é um tema bastante invisibilizado, de certa forma, no que ocorre de fato dentro do acolhimento. Um tema que, já partilhando com o trabalho maravilhoso da professora Sonia Kramer, um tema que eu gostaria de não ter que retornar em 2019, mas que, enfim, é necessário, vamos entender por quê. Então, a minha reflexão é em torno da pergunta out of place, né? Fora de lugar. Né? Quem está fora de lugar? O que é estar fora de lugar? Né? E aí o foco vai ser muito em torno do asilamento e do confinamento como práticas historicamente constituídas, no passado visto como uma solução para essa criança tida como menor, e uma trajetória que foi das grandes instituições fechadas, as instituições totais lá de Goffman, de Foucault, para as instituições de acolhimento, de abrigo, o abrigamento de acolhimento institucional. Então, pensando conceitualmente, pensando em ideias e a relação das ideias com as práticas, meu foco vai ser realmente o Brasil, mas nós estamos em uma rede internacional, pensando infâncias, adolescências e juventudes em várias partes do mundo, nessa discussão que acumula crianças do sul global, crianças com norte global, de uma forma às vezes muito equivocada, para fazer essa pergunta: que crianças estariam fora de lugar? Quando fazemos essa pergunta, eu já começo essa provocação, né? Que fora de lugar elas nunca estiveram. Elas estiveram, os menores, abandonados, delinquentes, crianças criminosas, pivetes, as crianças carentes de outrora, né? Tiveram destinos, e creio que em todas as apresentações que nós ouvimos aqui, em determinados espaços, em determinados lugares, socialmente inscritos, social e economicamente, politicamente inscritos. Então, fora de lugar não estavam. Qual o lugar ou quais os lugares destinados a essas crianças? E aí eu estou me referindo a crianças, mas pensando em infância e juventude, né, como em espaços a elas destinados e de que forma isso vem acontecendo. De certa forma, o tempo é muito curto, mas nós estamos falando em mais de 3 décadas de pesquisas nossas sobre esse abandono, essa construção social dessa criança hoje marginalizada, a criança que hoje chamamos em situação de rua, em abrigamento institucional, uma série de termos politicamente corretos hoje, mas que redundam, na verdade, naquela criança menorizada, daquela criança de menor valimento
social, econômico, político em nossas sociedades. E aí eu pergunto se seriam ambivalências, seriam contradições? Não. Assim como lugares a elas foram destinados, elas, na verdade, fazem parte dessa dualidade da proteção, da assistência, né? A assistência coligada à justiça, sempre foi, né? Da criança que é vista como em risco, abandonada, precisando ser protegida, né? E a criança que ultrapassa, né, os limites de uma criança em risco e se torna uma criança vista como um risco ou uma ameaça à sociedade. Essas passam, portanto, a ser o foco essencial da justiça e a elas também destinos múltiplos, sobretudo de confinamento, asilamento, seja nos internatos menores do passado, no sistema socioeducativo de privação de liberdade hoje, ou nas instituições psiquiátricas e nesse tipo de asilamento. E esses adolescentes não serão retratados nessa apresentação por uma questão de tempo, mas é interessante o contraste. Nós vamos estar focando muito mais naquela criança considerada em risco e que terminará nas instituições de acolhimento. Eu trouxe apenas 2 fotos para mostrar a ideia de salvação da criança do século XIX para o XX em práticas instituídas, sobretudo nas primeiras décadas do século XX, em grandes instituições fechadas, em que esses menores, né, considerados abandonados, carentes, delinquentes ou em perigo de se tornarem delinquentes, eram recolhidos, né, no recolhimento, que temos aí várias relações com práticas atuais, apesar das mudanças importantes no campo dos direitos humanos que nós tivemos dos anos 80 para cá, com referencial de direitos humanos da Convenção dos Direitos da Criança e do Estatuto da Criança e do Adolescente de 1990 no Brasil. Uma outra foto vai mostrar também um tipo de lugar, o tipo de espaço social que crianças, meninas aqui no caso, sobretudo, isso é uma instituição feminina, eram levadas nas suas camas, centenas e centenas de dormitórios, de locais para comida, e numa forma de docilizar, de arregimentar, de disciplinar essas crianças, uma prática que foi bastante condenada ao longo do tempo. Nós tivemos participação, né, muito importante, né, Sônia, nessa história dessa mudança do campo institucional. Aqui também a professora Joana Garcia, várias companheiras de pesquisa que vieram demonstrando essas mudanças, né? Então, de certa forma, o lugar do asilo, né, mesmo com a terminologia do abrigamento e do acolhimento, que é a terminologia contemporânea politicamente correta, nós estamos falando de um exílio, né? Nós estamos falando de um determinado espaço que não é naquele espaço da família, né? Não é naquele espaço, até mesmo do contexto da rua, como algumas pesquisas vêm mostrando, como possibilidade de sobrevivência e de resiliência nesses espaços, mas é o local do asilamento, cujas práticas foram comandadas por classificar, recolher, internar, reeducar e reabilitar. Obviamente não tenho tempo para analisar, cada um desses termos contém ideologias importantes para a compreensão desse processo, assim como práticas que as acompanharam, mas essa literatura está toda bastante rica, existente, está toda no site do CIESPI também, vocês podem acessar. E aí eu espaço para as formas contemporâneas de asilamento. Vou explicar um pouquinho porque são muitos dados e o tempo é curto. Nós estamos vendo aqui, no Brasil, de 2019, a taxa de acolhidos, nós temos mais ou menos 47 mil crianças, em comparação, obviamente, com o passado. As instituições eram muito maiores, assim, abrigavam um número muito maior, mas a população também era menor. Então, nós vamos ter os estados que mais acolhem. Nós estamos falando aqui, essencialmente, do sul e do sudeste brasileiro, né? Nós temos, na verdade, Rio Grande do Sul com a maior taxa de acolhimento, que é até surpreendente, né? Mas há certamente razões, e isso também varia nos estados com aquelas políticas de limpeza social, quando elas vêm com mais força. Essas políticas, a determinação vai ser policial mesmo, de recolhimento da população em massa. Não necessariamente a população recolhida vai para o acolhimento institucional. Hoje nós temos, nas nossas pesquisas, buscado no Brasil todo, nós temos 3 projetos focalizando esse tema do acolhimento institucional. Nós vamos encontrar uma minoria, por exemplo, de crianças com passagem pelas ruas nessas instituições de acolhimento, e vocês já vão entender já. Elas, quando recolhidas, portanto, vão diretamente para o sistema judiciário, elas acabam no chamado sistema socioeducativo, ontem bastante reconhecido como um sistema prisional contemporâneo, e lá eles estarão confinados. Os estados com índice menor de acolhimento vão estar no norte do país, é uma população também menor. São os estados onde hoje nós temos mais questões de fronteiras, nas fronteiras amazônicas e nas fronteiras em que os processos imigratórios, sobretudo Venezuela, vêm acontecendo. Mas, na verdade, nós estamos vendo aqui que menor acolhimento, de fato, em termos de taxa, só o Tocantins. Outro dado interessante é o número grande, para aqueles que estão estudando primeira infância aqui presentes, número alto, né, de crianças abrigadas na faixa de 0 a 6 anos, vocês vão entender também quando eu explicar os motivos. Depois nós temos aqui essa faixa bem complexa, que é a faixa da adolescência. Não sabemos o que fazer com os adolescentes nessa trajetória, né, mostrada como fora da curva, né? Meninas e meninos não tem uma grande diferença. Aqui nós entendemos o porquê, né? E ontem a Joe Boyd localizava a questão da culpabilização e a responsabilização em cima da família. E quando nós estamos falando em família e nós estamos falando em população em situação de pobreza, nós estamos falando que essa culpabilização essencialmente recai sobre as mães. As mães que são consideradas negligentes, né? Os pais negligentes, dependência química, abandono dos pais, violência doméstica, abuso sexual, pais irresponsáveis. O ponto pertinente que nós voltamos à palestra de ontem, em que ela falava onde está a responsabilização do Estado, da questão da violência estrutural, né, que permite essas situações de vidas e de condições de vidas muito desumanas, né? Esse é um ponto importante para repensarmos. Eu vou caminhando para a conclusão, querendo fazer uma relação entre os temas importantes de nossas pesquisas internacionais, com o grupo que está aqui conosco na conferência, e a discussão da convenção, sobretudo na questão da participação infantil e juvenil e da escuta de crianças, que é um tema também extremamente caro para o CIESPI, inclusive as metodologias de escuta, né, das crianças nos primeiros anos de vida e na infância e na adolescência, sobretudo na infância. E aqui nós temos uma menção às violações de direitos no acolhimento institucional, um tema pouco estudado. Eu tenho alguns alunos e pesquisadores comigo olhando para esse tema mais de perto agora. Por exemplo, a construção do plano individual de atendimento, que precisa ser feito com a família e com a criança, né? E o adolescente. É um plano que requer escuta, ela demanda escuta, ela não pode ser feita sem a escuta da família, da criança e do adolescente. E, no entanto, frequentemente ela não acontece dessa forma, apenas marcando bem que por nossa legislação e por nossas políticas públicas, há tempos a criança obrigatoriamente teria que ser escutada e sua contribuição, enfim, sua opinião sobre aspectos da sua vida, obviamente dependendo da sua faixa etária. Nós estamos falando de crianças de 3 anos, crianças de 6 anos decidindo onde elas vão morar, esse tipo de coisa, mas é a possibilidade do respeito à voz de grupos, sobretudo crianças um pouco maiores. Esse é um tema extremamente invisível, razão pela qual a gente tem dado bastante atenção ultimamente. São 3 projetos que vêm olhando para as trajetórias dessas crianças quando estão dentro do acolhimento institucional, olhando a legislação que já prevê a escuta e a participação das crianças, assim como as políticas públicas que são basicamente referenciadas pela Convenção e pelo Estatuto, para a gente entender até que ponto existe a escuta ou não dentro desses espaços de acolhimento. Como as outras pesquisas, eu achei isso muito bacana, que a gente trouxe os depoimentos de crianças e adolescentes. É também uma forma de dizer, eles têm o que dizer, eles estão dizendo, a gente aqui não está escutando. Nesses 2 depoimentos, nós vamos ouvir um pouco a trajetória de abandono, de isolamento. Então, aqui são as referências ao estudo, né? Esse menino de 10 anos diz assim, ele está dentro do acolhimento institucional e nós estamos escutando o que ele diz, aqui eles falam que meu pai sabe que eu estou aqui, mas eu acho que ele não sabe. Vejam só a gravidade disso. Ele não sabe se a família sabe onde ele está, como se nós estivéssemos ainda ali no século XIX. É ruim não saber de nada assim, se um dia ele vai voltar, se ele vai me pegar ou não. Vejam a construção da identidade de abandono ainda presente em 2014 e hoje. Eu acho que para elas, uma pessoa está bem só porque tem comida. Essa é uma menina falando dos educadores dentro do abrigo. Então está muito bem, a gente só tem comida e roupa para vestir, sabe? Mas eu não acho, não estou bem não só por causa disso. Faltava alguma coisa. Que lá é um lugar muito solitário, muito sozinho e não tem afetividade. Eu achava importante todos os adolescentes fazerem atividades. Aqui vai se falar da ociosidade até hoje nessas instituições, e que, como as crianças ficam num limbo, e normalmente, contra a lei, ficam mais do que 1, 2 anos, às vezes 3, 4 anos, e ficam, às vezes, até os 18, depois não tem para onde ir, é outra questão seríssima no nosso país. Ela vai dizer assim, porque é bem melhor do que ficar parado, tipo assim, na casa de passagem, sentado, esperando, sem poder fazer nada. O nome já diz, é uma casa de passagem, tu sabe que não vai ficar ali, né? Aí você não está na sua casa, você não sabe para onde que vai, aí tu entra em desespero, mais desespero do que tu já está. Você está falando, né, de estar numa situação de total limbo, sem saber para onde vai e por que está ali. Né? Muito, muito, muito longe da ideia de participação e de escuta e de respeito à voz dessa população. E por fim, no último depoimento, uma coisa que precisa nesse abrigo é uma vez por semana, tem que ter alguém que converse com a gente. Olha a gravidade disso. Alguém que converse com a gente uma vez por semana, O abrigo precisa conversar com a gente, ver o nosso pensamento e ajudar a gente. Não é não? Tem coisa mais sensata do que essa pergunta? E terminando, já terminei, eu, na verdade, aqui tem algumas referências, isso é público, depois vocês podem ter acesso a essas informações. Esse material está sistematizado numa base de dados bibliográfica de 2015 até o presente, com acesso a uma síntese a essa produção e acesso aos PDFs dos artigos, de modo que nós pensamos que, ao destacar essa produção e ao destacar as lacunas que ainda temos e destacar, sobretudo, as vozes das crianças e dos adolescentes nos lugares mais confinados, nós acreditamos que possamos, dessa forma, enriquecer a nossa produção científica, subsidiar melhor as práticas voltadas para essa população e sair da retórica de ficar repetindo que é importante dar voz às crianças. Obrigada.
Então, abrir para algumas perguntas. Eu entendo que a fala da Irene nos convida a lembrar, como está em todas as falas, que esses números dos índices, as estatísticas que a gente observa, tem subjacente cada um desses números um rosto, uma fala e os direitos das crianças presentes, né? Essa pergunta com que ela começa a sua fala, quantos nomes podem ter crianças e jovens que historicamente foram conceituados, e como superar isolamento e asilamento com a perspectiva do direito e das políticas públicas. Eu queria abrir, acredito que a gente possa ter algum tempo para perguntas. Queria apenas pedir a cada um que se apresentasse, dizendo qual é a sua instituição. Está aberto, então. Pois não?
Olá, bom dia, eu sou a Irene, sou psicóloga, trabalho no CAPS infantil, em Jacarepaguá. Eu queria um pouco que a professora Irene falasse dessa perspectiva, né, de escutar essas crianças, né, com toda essa experiência no campo. Enfim, o trabalho do CAPS consiste basicamente na escuta, né? E a gente queria um pouco pensar isso enquanto política pública, assim, né, se todos esses estudos, todo esse trabalho, enfim, desenvolvido com essas crianças asiladas, abrigadas, enfim, se tem alguma direção, assim, que vocês pensam de trabalho, assim, de alguma coisa que já está mais consistente, assim, desse repertório que vocês já acumularam de escuta dessas dificuldades todas que essas crianças enfrentam, esses desafios todos de estarem nessa condição de precariedade total que a gente sabe das instituições, enfim, infelizmente a maioria delas não são os melhores lugares, né, para essas crianças estarem, mas pensar política pública, o que vocês pensam, o que a gente poderia melhorar para essas crianças?
Explica só o que é o CAPS, para quem não sabe.
É o Centro de Atenção para a Infância e Adolescência, que a gente atende, é um serviço de saúde mental, na verdade.
Obrigada, Irene. Podemos fazer mais uma ou duas, depois não, aqui.
Bom dia, meu nome é Cleiton, sou do 5º período de Relações Internacionais. A minha pergunta, de certa forma, vai para todas as pessoas na mesa. Basicamente, todas as falas apresentadas por vocês tentam apresentar um pouco sobre as pessoas que estão sendo excluídas da ideia da concepção de infância. A concepção de infância, seja das menores idades, seja das adolescências. A minha pergunta vai mais no sentido de qual a alternativa que vocês veem no âmbito das próprias questões jurídicas e das questões práticas para trazer um pouco de luz e capacidade de voz para essas parcelas de crianças que acabam sendo excluídas dentro da própria convenção e do próprio convívio social e da decisão das políticas públicas voltadas a elas. Obrigado.
Podemos fazer mais uma?
Bom dia, meu nome é Sonia Kramer. Como disse a Irene, venho pesquisando essa questão, particularmente do acolhimento há muitos anos, até hoje. Eu sou professora da UERJ. E a questão que eu colocaria para a Irene, mas talvez para outros também, é dentro dessa ideia de escuta, que no caso seria uma escuta mais profissional, no sentido de um psicólogo, enfim, de alguém que estaria ali atendendo, de certa maneira, dando um amparo, um tratamento. Mas uma das coisas que eu noto é que essa criança pode ser atendida no caso pode, não quer dizer que vai ser, tá? São poucas vagas, ela precisa dessa escuta, mas se ela for trocada de abrigo, ficar longe, ou se ela sair com uma família acolhedora, muda tudo. Ou seja, o que eu acho que precisa, dentro dessa ideia de escuta, é ter alguém que possa, de fato, coordenar, no sentido de dar um segmento, um fio na vida dessa criança. E aí eu tenho como exemplo prático uma criança que eu sigo há 5, 6 anos, que vai de um lugar para outro, para outro, para outro, para outro. A rede não faz isso. A rede, se a criança estiver no abrigo, vai ser uma equipe ligada ao abrigo. Se ela for para adoção, ela vai ser atendida pela equipe da adoção. Se ela for rejeitada pela adoção, ela vai para a equipe de família acolhedora. E assim vai. É jogada de uma equipe para outra, muito difícil. Não tem ninguém na rede, porque a maneira como a rede é organizada não favorece isso. A criança, a vida dela é segmentada nessas várias visões e, em geral, tende-se a ser negativa. Porque o menino não para aqui, o menino não para ali, não para acolá, rejeita a adoção. E eu tenho um caso que eu sigo há, no mínimo, 5 anos, que nós fomos retiradas da mãe, por causa que a mãe usava muito crack, com 3 e 5 anos. E foram para um abrigo, depois foram para adoção, foram devolvidas, pequenininhas, e começou mais tentativa de 4 adoções que eram devolvidas, até que a rede resolveu separar os meninos, até que o mais velho, que começou a se tratar comigo na idade de 7 anos, mais ou menos, hoje em dia, 7, 8 anos, ele já está fazendo 14 agora em julho. Como eu sou professora da UERJ e atendo na UERJ, ele rodava esse mundo todo, mas ia lá para ser atendido por mim. E por livre espontânea vontade, inclusive. Se virava com o negócio de passagem, eventualmente eu dava um cartãozinho. E eu acho que isso ajudou demais a ele não cair para o lado, digamos, de droga, de um caminho, digamos, de roubo. É uma história bastante interessante. Mas o que eu sinto, então, através dessa experiência, é que falta alguém que comece e que siga essa criança dentro da rede, para ela ter um ponto de referência e de alguém que ela confie, porque ele não confia nas pessoas. Muito interessante isso. O irmãozinho dele, que eu há pouco tempo encontrei no irmãozinho que já está com 11 anos, uma briga, falou, não, na psicóloga Sônia eu confio, ou seja, porque ele já conhece a relação, ele já também tinha se tratado comigo num grupinho que eu fazia na UERJ, e agora a volta para casa, porque o mais velho descobriu a mãe, e a volta para casa está sendo um trabalhão, sobretudo meu, porque a rede não dá conta de fazer esse trabalho, de refazer essa relação com os pais, ou melhor com a mãe, e de mínimo de infraestrutura para poder receber esses meninos. Então a pergunta é essa, que escuta é essa, e alguém que dentro da rede favoreça que todos esses fragmentos da vida tenham um ponto que possa ser seguido.
Muito obrigada, Sônia. Irene, e quem vai responder a pergunta do Cleiton? Irene, a pergunta da Aline, por favor.
A questão da Aline e da Sônia. Eu acho que eu vou juntar as duas, pegando o gancho do que a Sônia falou, que é, apesar da existência do referencial das nossas... Mas tá ligado. Agora... Tá igual, tá legal? Apesar de todo o referencial que vem, inclusive, dando ênfase à questão da escuta, são muitas as escutas, são muitas as possibilidades. E Sônia mencionou outro tipo de escuta, assim como a Aline, que é uma escuta profissional, no sentido do atendimento, do cuidado, seja do ponto de vista da saúde mental, né, nos CAPCIs, que vieram como uma proposta após o Estatuto, justamente na ideia da reforma psiquiátrica brasileira, que foi absolutamente crucial, realmente revolucionou o atendimento, né, essa população, criando os espaços comunitários, os espaços abertos, mas como a Sônia contou, não dá conta. Não é que os hospitais psiquiátricos, confinamento no sentido asilar, também vão dar conta, não vão, né? Ou as alternativas das clínicas super contestadas que vêm surgindo aí, também não vão dar conta, e tem muitos interesses econômicos e por trás religiosos, né, nesse tipo de atendimento. Então são muitos tipos de escuta, e eu acho que foi bom ter levantado isso, porque pelo próprio Estatuto e pela Convenção, o artigo 12 e o artigo 16 do Estatuto, a gente vai pensar muito mais nas vozes que ficam, não são escutadas, e quando não são levadas de fato a sério, mas não abordam necessariamente esse aspecto do cuidado. Infelizmente, não estamos numa maré favorável para ampliar essa possibilidade de uma escuta qualificada e respeitosa. Eu diria, tanto no campo psiquiátrico, eu acho que mais do que nunca estamos em altíssimo risco de perder, inclusive, os CAPCIs. E do ponto de vista do chamado sistema de garantias de direitos, que é uma ideia linda, que é a ideia da intersetorialidade, do sistema que une todos os serviços, inclusive o judiciário, que é complicado, num sistema que deveria funcionar como uma rede. É uma ideia super bonita, revolucionária, mas as estruturas físicas, as estruturas orçamentárias são todas fragmentadas. Os espaços são longe, as pessoas não têm incentivos profissionais para trabalhar de forma coligada. Então, o resultado é o que a Sônia contou e o que a gente vê acontecer em outros países também. Se a gente analisar a situação no foster care, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos, a gente vai ver várias pesquisas que mostram a fragmentação, a devolução das crianças, as crianças passando de casa em casa, e a inexistência de uma figura central que ligue, porque não é só ter um sistema tipo o CIESPI que vai monitorar, que já seria bom, né? Monitorar a trajetória dessas crianças no sistema seria muito importante, mas para além disso, para além do sistema, que pessoas passam a ser referências positivas para essa população. Isso nós não conseguimos construir, é extremamente difícil, e eles ficam assim, naquela situação, estamos aqui, não sabemos se alguém vai buscar. A questão da devolução das crianças adotadas, com todo o tempo que se leva, com todo o cuidado que se diz ter, todo o preparo, e as crianças são devolvidas com coisas. Então nós temos aí grandes desafios, num momento não muito favorável, talvez favorável para que nos articulemos melhor, porque na crise grande a gente acaba se coligando mais, ou não é? Crítica para nós próprios.
A professora Mônica vai começar a responder a pergunta do Cleiton.
Thank you, Clayton. A very good question. So 3 ideas that come to mind. One is very basic, which is, and then I'm coming, of course, from health field, but I'm always advocating for disaggregating the data we have to render this reality visible. So when I started working with child-headed households in Namibia, there was no estimate. There was anecdotal evidence that they existed from people in the field, but there was no statistic. We didn't know there were few, there were many, so it was just working with the census office that suddenly we could have disaggregated, and then the government started doing it regularly, and they've been doing it now for almost 20 years. So, very basic thing is, use what you have to render this reality visible. Another thing that came up through the study and then led to changes more specifically is that the young people were complaining that they were not having access to orphan grants, what they call orphan grants, so welfare assistance, because they were under 18. So this led to a change in policy whereby it's not required that it's an adult who submits the request to the ministry. It could be the head of the household, even if it's a young person. So that was another concrete example of how you can have concrete policy and programmatic changes. Another one would be, and there have been changes in a number of countries in legislation requiring that young people are consulted, at least consulted, in decisions that affect them. It might be before having surgery, or like it might be in the context of healthcare or welfare or whatever. But then I will add, I'm based in a primary care center, and even with those service providers who are attuned, who'd like to engage young people, sometimes they're not equipped. They don't know how to, we have lots of pediatricians who don't know how to talk to a child of a certain age in a way that is not imposing. I mean, it's always important to talk to a doctor for a young child, so the skills. But also, there's bigger policy changes that need to happen, because at least our physicians are under great pressure to see this many patients during the day. So they cannot spend more than maybe 10 or 15 minutes per patient. So you need to make institutional changes as well as policy changes to make sure that you create the space. You cannot rush anybody, but certainly not a young person, into making certain decisions, or so those could be examples maybe of how policy changes are needed as well. But I'm sure other presenters have other things.
Sure. So in relation to the work that we were doing in the city with young people in the streets, this exclusion from space was something that's been around a long time, and particularly the sort of violence towards young people in the streets. So I guess pushing for policy changes at international levels. So the CRC doesn't specifically address those issues of street roundups. So general comments, for example, the one that came out in 2017 around children in street situations, one of the key principles there was to reduce violence against children, particularly around their right to be on the street. But again, of course, that requires governments to sign up to this and then also to implement. So one of the things that we did as part of our research project, because we had a long-term project, we were able to build lots of knowledge exchange into the process. So the point that Irene made about listening to children is imperative. So how do you work with policymakers over a long time to involve them in discussions with children about what it's like, what the realities are, and how they could be better supported in those places is really important. I think one of the challenges with that is that governments and local governments are short-term. They change every year or every couple of years, and then you have different ministers in charge, and then policies change quite dramatically, and the way in which young people are treated then changes quite dramatically. So it's about how you maintain that over time is important.
Entendendo que a gente não vai ter outra rodada de perguntas, estou correta? Pela hora, por isso eu convidei as pessoas a responderem como a pergunta do Cleiton foi dirigida a todo mundo. Sim, porque a outra mesa é 11h15. Estou correta? Sim, pergunta. Okay.
I don't think this is it on? Yeah, okay. So a lot of the things has been said, but in the case of Amara, I also want to emphasize that it's not actually about the legal framework, it's really there. We have ratified and implemented the UNCRC in our constitution and in all of the relevant laws. So it's more about the institutionalized practices, regulations, expectations, and a very strong discourse within the Norwegian society how we perceive childhood. So what I think we need to work on is broaden this notion of childhood to being much more inclusive, and embracing diversity. And this is something that has always been the case, but even more so in increasingly a society where we have much more immigrants as well. And then, of course, as has been said, it's not enough to have the laws and the rights. We do actually have to consult the children, even though they sometimes disagree with the social workers. And I think we need, and that is something we're working on, is that we need to train our future social workers to actually have the capacity and the belief that they're able to speak with young people and to have this more broader notion of child.
Okay, I was waiting for the light. So, just a very little thing, because I think everyone said that the important thing is to listen to children. And it is important also in our context, but it is very hard to do it. So, in my experience with children and with adolescents, they have a very clear demand on SRH information. For example, they actually want to hear they want to access more information, they want to know more, but they don't know where to go. And girls and boys want to be heard also about what is this imbalance of power relations, why do we have to think about it. So they're demanding, but they also felt that the adults are not listening to them, and also there is some concerns about some religious concerns about how to do the correct thing, because when we speak about gender, it seems to be very difficult for everyone to understand that gender is inside the discussion about rights. No, it's just for them, gender is such a bad word.
Queria então agradecer muito aos participantes, Lorraine, Irene, Mônica, Vanessa e Marit. Acho que nós todos estamos provocados e convocados a pensar nesse difícil tema da escuta em contextos de políticas públicas adversos. E, para mim, pessoalmente, queria agradecer aqui por moderar essa mesa e dizer que, em momentos políticos tão difíceis, penso que precisamos nos voltar para as práticas. Claro, trabalhar pelas políticas, mas o tema da escuta, ele é, sim, do âmbito profissional, mas ele é do âmbito pessoal de cada um de nós também, nas suas diferentes áreas, como vimos aqui, na antropologia, na geografia, no campo da psiquiatria, no serviço social, da geografia, no campo da educação. Né? Então, que continuemos convocados, aí, provocados. Muito obrigada, foi uma belíssima mesa, muito obrigada.
Intervalo de 5 minutos e voltamos, tá bem breve mesmo, para a gente continuar nossas conversas.